Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals know what they're passionate about, in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's episode, I interview my dad, Marcus Earle, on how this podcast came to be and our vision for the podcast. Dr. Marcus Earle is a graduate of Virginia Tech University, where he earned a doctorate degree in marriage and family therapy in 1988. He is a clinical director in a group private practice with his father, my grandfather, Dr. Ralph Earle, at Psychological Counseling Services in Scottsdale, Arizona. Dr. Earle is licensed as a psychologist and certified as a marriage and family therapist in Arizona. He specializes in working with addictions and sexual offenders, as well as doing individual and family therapy. Dr. Earle co-leads compulsivity and codependency groups and conducts couples communication workshops and marital and family enrichment programs with his wife, my mom, Robin. He has also co-authored the book Sex Addiction, Case Studies in Management with his father, Ralph H. Earle. So without further ado, let's listen to the interview. All right, Dad. Well, why don't you start off and give our listeners an idea of how this podcast came to be?
Well, I think you raised the idea initially of doing a podcast, and it isn't something that I think I would have thought on my own. So I've had friends that listen to podcasts. It is not a habit that I've gotten into. And then you started listening to a podcast, and I think we started the conversation then about, well, what if PCS did a podcast? And I go, well, I'm interested. And from there, I think we continued the conversation, and here we are with our first podcast.
Sure. Here we are. Yeah, I think for me, I didn't think I'd ever get into podcasts, but I started listening to them, and it's just such a great thing to do while you're doing chores or on your commute. And I've been really influenced by a number of podcasts out there, especially podcasts like The Radical Therapist and Practice of the Practice that are in our field and really giving clients and therapists helpful pieces of information in the realms of psychotherapy.
Well, that's what I'm excited about. Is I've seen what your listening to podcasts have done for you, and I've enjoyed the conversations we've had as you've listened and learned from others. And certainly as your dad, it's just a huge to me, exciting piece of life right now, or moment in time where we get to work together. Something that I didn't imagine would happen, and now we're having the opportunity to do that. The other things that I am thinking about with this podcast is you getting to introduce the different therapists in our practice, and for people to get to experience them with both their experience and their knowledge, because I think that is what I like best about PCS is that it isn't only our expertise, it's the experience of the people in the practice that makes a difference.
Sure. Great. Well, on that note, let's. I'm curious. What are some of your goals for this podcast or intentions?
Really, to answer people's questions and to provide information to them. So I'm hopeful of a couple of things. That one, in each podcast, we'll answer a good deal of questions that people have. And what I imagine is it will trigger more questions. And so what I'm hopeful is that people will post comments, and that in the future we can respond to their comments, and they'll post the questions that they have, and we can respond to the questions to make it somewhat of an interactive process.
Sure. I think that's great. And there's definitely a number of podcasts that I'm a big fan of where they have various therapists who answer questions that people have, and I think that there's so much value in a clinician's answer, with all of the experience that clinicians have in supporting people and dealing with their problems. And I really like that idea of that back and forth conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about intentions or goals for the podcast?
Yeah, it's interesting because as a clinical director, I know that I know the therapist quite well, and what I also know is there's a lot I don't know. And so for me, another exciting piece of this is that I'm gonna learn more about the therapist, and actually I think I'll be learning a great deal as well. I've certainly found that to be true in our intensive process when I am working with a client in our intensive process, and then find that I've learned something new from one of our other therapists. They pick up on something, they do something with the client that I wouldn't have thought of or even noticed with clients. And so I'm super excited about the opportunity to see what I can learn from our therapists.
Sure. And for me as well, I'm really excited about this opportunity to facilitate a context where your therapist can really get in touch with what they're passionate about. And I think in that process, I'm hoping that it lends to pieces of hope for our listeners, and hopefully it allows our listeners to view problems maybe in different ways, or come to solutions to problems in their lives that they wouldn't have otherwise come to, whether they're dealing with depression, anxiety, PTSD, shame. I'm hoping that this is a context where, the therapist who he interviews, understandings will really be helpful for our listeners in that regard. And then I know that you've talked about the importance of connection and being better together. Do you want to talk on that a little bit in terms of PCS's mission, and maybe how you would envision that in the realms of this podcast?
Yes, as we were talking, the other thought that came to mind is that I would want this to also be personal and not just simply professional. I do think that is what makes for great therapy. And so although this won't be doing therapy with people, I think the information that we provide, I'm hoping, is also personal and not just simply a clinical exercise for us. I think that's what creates the richness in the work that we do, is bringing who we are as people into the process and not just simply apply skills. And so what you were talking about in terms of, we're better together, I have found that, I've been doing this for over 30 years now, and I've gained confidence in my skills and my ability to help clients. And even with that confidence, I continually am reminded and aware of how much better I am when I'm working with another therapist, or two for that matter. And so what I believe is as we keep unfolding these podcasts with time, that people are going to find that this collective experience, this collective expertise is something that creates a special opportunity for them to more fully understand, their own mental health issues, their own struggles in their relationships, and even some of their strengths. Because I think there's this mixture of in our field or challenge in our field, but too often being focused on the challenges and the problems. And I know for me, it's become important, and this is one of the things I think age brings is perspective, is to also balance, with what people bring to the table that are their strengths and their abilities. And so in each and every challenge, there's these sometimes hidden, sometimes unknown strengths and abilities that we have. So I'm hoping that what we share helps people to tap into that part of them as well.
Yeah, that's deeply resonant with me and what I've been learning in grad school right now, and what's really been exciting to me in terms of the content that I've been learning about. focusing on solutions, focusing on strengths, like you were saying, and exceptions to the problem. Another thing that I was thinking of was a goal of mine for the podcast is to destigmatize psychotherapy. I think a lot of people end up in therapy when things are like rock bottom, and I think part of the reason for that might be therapy just has such a stigma around it, so a lot of people just kind of avoid it until the problem that they're dealing with is just, bearing down on them. And so I hope that we can normalize, the experiences of depression, shame, anxiety, these common problems that I think we all experience. And this podcast can serve as a platform for normalizing those sorts of experiences, and normalizing going to therapy, and giving people a better idea of what happens in therapy too. So yeah, do you have anything else on in terms of goals or intentions that you want to add?
No, I would just reiterate that last point. I know my experience is that what's very exciting for me in a moment is when somebody comes in their first year of marriage, or when they're in their young 20s, and they're already starting to pay attention to what's going on in their life and wanting to work on that. For me as a therapist, it's an incredibly exciting moment. And it is so much easier to begin young and get a handle on, where these stuck points are for us, these challenges, these blocks to intimacy. So I love what you just said, and am very optimistic about the future for people if they can get started earlier. And having waited longer in my own life to do some of my work, it does take a bit longer. It's a bit more challenging. Some of the ruts that I get stuck in, or have been stuck in, that have been problematic in marriage, problematic even in our relationship. So I do believe that we're going to be able to open doors for people and make it safer, hopefully create a willingness to get started earlier.
And on speaking on that point too, what comes to mind for me with talking about your journey, I do agree that, the earlier the better you can get started on this work. And at the same time, I just think it's never too late, and personally for me too, within the context of our family, I've just been really grateful for all the work that I've seen people doing around the problems in their lives and the problems in our relationships, that have been passed down in our family. So I have a lot of I experience a lot of optimism and hope around that, and I hope that these conversations that I have on the podcast can inspire that for others as well.
Yes, and I'm hopeful that in some of the future podcasts that we get to share some of our journey and include my dad, Dr. Ralph, in those conversations at all. So we're going to have 3 generations in this conversation at points, which I think could be a great experience for us personally, and I hope something that others can learn from as well.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.